All right, hello. So in this video, we're going to cover how to get started programming in Python, and not less about how to actually write the language, and more in particular about how to use Jupyter Notebooks, which is going to be the environment that we'll be doing most of our actual programming in. Not all of our programming, we'll do some stuff outside of that as well, but most of the work we'll be doing in most of the Python programming that is done in the world happens in Jupyter Notebooks. So Jupyter is a web application that lets you write and run Python code directly inside of your web browser. So it provides a sort of web interface for being able to do a lot of the kind of programming, structuring kind of work that we're interested in. So for most of the class, you're going to be accessing Jupyter inside of Ed, and so no extra setup is going to be needed. However, if you do want to run Jupyter and do some Python programming outside of sort of that Ed platform, and you want to run it on your own machine, like if you want to experiment, you want to practice or anything else, I'm going to sort of walk you through how to sort of get that up and running. So the easiest way to do that is going to be opening what's called the Anaconda Navigator. So if you've installed Python through Anaconda, which would be my recommended way of getting Python installed and working on your machine, that should come with a program called the Anaconda Navigator, which basically sort of it loads in a bunch of different Python-related applications to sort of get you where you need to go. So one of those is called Jupyter Notebook. You don't want Jupyter Lab; it's a little bit different system. But so with Jupyter Notebook, you can then use this Navigator to launch it in order to open up and start up the sort of notebook server, the notebook system, so you're able to then write this code. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that out. What that's going to do is that's going to open up a command prompt or command line console, which will then sort of be running the server and getting some stuff up and running. So just let that sit for a minute, and then once it goes, it should open up a browser, which has the Jupyter Notebook here. And I'll go ahead and grab that for us to see. Okay, so this then brings up the Jupyter Notebook sort of server. So you'll see that it's running inside of a browser. Right? It's just running inside of Chrome. It's loading it at what's called localhost, which is my sort of local computer. And so this is basically browsing through my computer, where I can then use that to determine which files, which notebooks, right? Which program files do I want to open in order to be able to work with. So this gives us a view of the folder system of my computer. This is exactly like what you might see in Finder or you might see in File Explorer, right? It's just telling me here are all the folders on my computer. So here's sort of my home, my root directory, and it's got my desktop, my documents folder, downloads folder, etc. I could go to my desktop, and then I've got a demos folder inside of there, and there's other things as well. So you can use that to be able to navigate around folders. So you figure out where you want if you're trying to find a particular file to open, or if you want to figure out where do I want to make this new file, you can click through these folders to navigate where we want to be able to go. So for example, I can go to my desktop, or I can click the sort of home button in order to go back to the home. Once I go to my desktop, I can then go ahead and create a new notebook file, which is going to have where my code can then live. So I'm going to do that by using this new button, this new key button sort of up in the corner here. So I'm going to click New, and then I'm going to click Python 3 in order to create a new Python 3 notebook as opposed to some other kind of file. If you don't have the Python 3 notebook option available, it means you probably haven't installed Python correctly on your machine, and I would go back and check that. Again, make sure if you've installed Anaconda, this should all work out just fine. So I'm going to go ahead and create myself a new Python 3 notebook. And when you do that, that'll open up a new tab, a new browser, and it'll create this new file for us, this new system for us to work in. And this is where we're going to be writing our Python code, is in this kind of interface. So the first thing we can do is actually, do you see how it says up here at the top, it says untitled? I can actually click that in order to change it, to give it a name. So for example, this can be I'm going to just call this thing demo, or how about we'll call this Jupyter example. I click rename, and that then renames the file that I'm actually working with. If I go back to my file listing here, right, that was shown in my other window, you can see that there's now a file in here called jupyterexample.ipynb. IPYNB stands for IPython Notebook. IPython was the original name of Jupyter, like decades ago, back before it became Jupyter, and so the file extension is still called IPYNB. But so those are then the names of notebooks, individual notebooks, where we'll have sets of code that can get written. You could have lots of different notebooks that might have lots of different code, maybe like one for each project or one for each thing that you're working on. If you want to open one of these, right, I could just navigate through from the Jupyter server here. I could just navigate through to this file and then click on it in order to open it up inside of a new window, right? If I click on that, it opens it up inside of a new tab. Note that you can't double click on IPYNB files in order to open them up, right? They're not like that file association doesn't quite work. You need to be sort of running this overall Jupyter system, which means you need to sort of launch Jupyter and then get to the file from there, right? You can't double click on the file and it opens in Word. You have to open up Word and then use that to open the file you want to see. Same kind of idea. Okay, so here is our Jupyter Notebook. So Jupyter Notebook is made up of what are called a collection of cells. So these cells is this thing that's now currently highlighted in green. So you can see this thing here is a cell. A cell is then something I can then type and write some code into. So I can type code into the cell. So for example, I can type print hello world, which is some Python code that you've talked about in the reading, to show you how that works. Hello world is the traditional first program that you write in any programming language or any programming environment. It's hello world, in order to just something that prints out hello world that sort of indicates that things run. As an aside, I don't know why hello world is the first program. It's tradition. That's the way that it is. A lot of what's involved in actually programming is both learning how to like speak the computer's language and understand how to write the code, but it's also in some ways understanding some of the culture around programming. I'm going to use the word culture very, very loosely with the biggest of air quotes around it, which is understanding sort of the vocabulary, the terminology, the jargon, but also sort of just like the way that things work and the way that programmers want to talk about things in order to be able to help you communicate with those people later. A lot of programming culture is problematic and it can be actually very, very toxic, particularly historically, in that it's generally been a very white male culture, and so it has all the sort of problems that then come along with that. It's gotten better over the years. But it's often worth just being aware of some of these traditions and some of these sort of inside jokes and some of these framings, because that's going to be ways of helping understand why particular examples work the way they are, and that's part of what's fun, right? It's being like, oh, I get it. That's this like inside running gag that's being happening here. Hello World is one of these kind of examples of that happening. Anyway, so we've written some code, right? I've written hello world here. Now, in order to so this is me writing instruction to the computer. I'm saying print out the text hello world. And then in order to actually tell the computer to do that, to follow that instruction, I need to do what's called executing this cell. I need to run the cell to say, computer, do what I just told you to do. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to make sure that we've got our cursor, we've selected the cell, so it's highlighted in green, and we're going to hit Shift and Enter, or return. And when I do that, you'll see that it immediately takes me to the next cell, makes a new one, but it also then shows me the output of hello world. So it says that you printed hello world, there's hello world getting printed right there. So Shift Enter, right? Again, Shift and Enter, that's the key that we're going to use to actually execute the code. That executes one cell at a time, telling the interpreter, do what I just told you to do. Now, what shows up, you'll notice in the square brackets, a little 1 shows up here. That's telling you not the number of the cell, but the number of which execution, which shift entering hit was causing that to happen, right? If I run this cell again, if I again select on it and then hit Shift Enter, that turns into a 2 because it now says the second execution is what that cell was doing, right? This result is me the second time changing this code. Cool. So we can have lots of cells that all have lots of code in them. Cells can have multiple lines of code. So for example, this could have multiple print statements. I could say print out some word first, and then print out some word second. And then again, I'm going to hit Shift Enter, and now it prints out those two things, right? It does the first line of code, and it does the second line of code running inside that cell. That's execution number 3. Cool. So to be clear, that runs this cell. Every line of code in the cell occurs when I run that cell, but that doesn't run any previous cells or any later cells. So if I actually change this to be hello Jupyter, when I run my second cell, I'm going to put my cursor down here in the second cell, I'm going to hit Shift Enter, you'll notice that it doesn't change my hello world because I haven't rerun that first cell again a second time. So again, you can think of each cell as a place to put chunks of code, but there's actually no inherent meaning or ordering in these cells, right? We often will write them top to bottom because that makes it easier for us to understand things, but you can really think of them almost all of each cell is almost like its own little scratch pad about where to put some code that you want to have something run. So you can put some stuff in the beginning and the end, and it doesn't really matter what that order is in most circumstances. Okay, cool. let's see, other things to note. So each cell, all the cells are run inside of what's called the same interpreter session. So you can almost think of it's like the same copy of Python, sort of, that's basically saying, oh, here's all this code that's being run sort of simultaneously. This will matter when we get to things like variables, which we'll talk about in a later video. So all these things are sort of running at the same time and sort of in the same context, like in the same room, or they're all running on the same system as well. Each notebook then runs in kind of its own little box, so that it has its own little world in which it does its own pieces. Now, the interpreter session, this thing that we're running on, in Jupyter is called the kernel. And that's actually written up here. You can see there's a menu here called kernel. So you can interact with this kernel through this kernel menu. And so there's a couple of things, if you click on that menu option, there's a couple of things we might want to do. The most common things that we'll want to do is we want to restart or reset the kernel. That basically is going to say effectively like reset the board. So it's like clears out all the previous code that I might have run, all the previous output, all the previous variables I've made, everything that I've sort of done ahead of time, where it's almost like let's reset like the board to be able to sort of like play a new game, right? To be able to sort of do something new a second time. So if I do restart and clear output, it'll confirm that I want to do that. And you'll notice that what happens is that all my executions disappear, right? So now it looks like my code is still there, but it's like as if I never executed the code. I never ran it. It never shows me those outputted messages anymore. So I can now rerun these cells, right? Or if I run hello Jupyter, that now becomes execution number 1 because like we've started over. My code is still there, right? The instructions I wrote haven't been lost, but the result of running that code has been reset. Similarly, under kernel, I can do a restart and run all, which will reset the whole thing, just like resetting clearing output, and then re-execute all the cells top to bottom one at a time. So if I do restart and run all, then it's going to reset so that it'll run the first cell first, and then the second cell the second time. So it prints hello Jupyter, and then first and second. This is useful for if you want to like make sure that your assignments work correctly, right? That you haven't, for example, made some change or written some code down at the bottom and then use the result of that up at the top because, you know, it's already been set up and it's already now part of like the world. So a good way for making sure everything sort of runs cleanly and it's sort of all ready to go and sort of published nicely and you haven't sort of like, you know, forgotten things somewhere is to go ahead and use the kernel, restart and run all to sort of make sure you run all your cells at once. Cool. All right, here we go. So most cells are code cells in that we can then type in some code and when we type in that code, it then makes them do some work. It's also possible to have cells that are not code cells. So if I click on this cell, you'll notice that in this interface, there's a drop-down menu that says code. I can actually select different styles of formatting. So if I select Markdown, which is like text, which is a kind of text language, it's a way of it's basically a way of formatting text. I can now start writing some content here that's not code, but is now going to be able to use to create formatting and structures on my documents. So I can use some special language, some special characters in order to sort of make it look in a particular way. So like a pound means makes it a heading. So I can say this is going to be a page title, and then I can include things like I love programming, right? And I can use sort of asterisks to sort of make something bold. Same thing you might see if you're like writing in text messages or Slack or Zoom or Wikipedia or anything like this is the same kind of things that happen. And then if I hit Shift Enter to execute this cell, you'll see that it now gives me some nice formatting. So this is how you can create cells that can create Jupyter notebooks that can have like descriptive text and then code and then descriptive text and then code, which is how most exercises will be structured for you to be working on. In general, you won't be needing to create a bunch of like textual cells, but I want to let you know that's sort of what's there. If you by accident click on this and start like getting it to the point where it looks like it's like not run anymore, it's not formatted, it looks sort of nasty, something looks like it's gone wrong, just hit Shift Enter and it'll go back to being clean and you're back to the cells that you used to have. Okay. Let's see. Other things that's worth noting that you can do, you won't need to do this a lot in your system, but it is possible to add and delete and move cells around. So for example, the way we can do that is that you'll notice that currently when I'm selecting the cell, you see how it's got a green box around it? And if I start typing in here, that's going to start typing in code right into this box. Now, in order to get out of the fact where I now have a particular cell selected, right, where I'm about to type into that box, I need to be able to effectively escape out of the like actually typing into the cell itself. And I can do that by hitting the escape key. And you'll notice that when I did that, I hit the escape key, my box becomes blue. And now if I type, a new cell appeared because I hit the wrong button, but you'll notice that no text is actually appearing inside the cell. You can see that that's not blue. I can actually use the arrow keys up and down to navigate through my different cells. Once I've done that, once I've selected a cell, not the content of the cell to type some code in, but the cell itself, I can then use my menus to manipulate that in different ways. So I can go to the edit menu in order to delete a cell, and you'll see that that's a keyboard shortcut, but I can delete the cell. That makes it go away. This one is now selected, so I can go ahead and delete that cell as well. I can also use the insert cell menu in order to insert cells above and below something. So if I want to say add a new cell before this title, I can do that, and now I have this new cell, right, which can then print out I am new. So we can then create these extra cells, and we can sort of manipulate how this notebook works. Again, you're not going to need to actually ever add or remove cells in assignments or exercises generally. And in fact, please don't do it in ed exercises. It's going to screw everything up. If you add or remove cells, it like ruins, it breaks everything. It breaks a bunch of things because they really depend on cells being lined up in a particular way. But you can do that if you're trying to, for example, develop your own notebook, or if you're just trying to figure out like why something went wrong. Right? If you see this goes blue, right, and you're wondering why nothing's working, just make sure you've actually like clicked inside the box to make sure you've typed it in. Okay, so there are, you can do this through the menus. There are also keyboard shortcuts, right? If you go into the command menu, there's different ways of being able to add these together. You can look up the keyboard shortcuts using this little keyboard icon, which is actually the little help icon overall. So if you want to know how to do something from the keyboard, right, with just typing in a keystroke without having to use the mouse, you can do that. If I want to know how to insert a cell, it'll let me be able to both select to actually go ahead and insert a cell, right? I'm just searching for insert cell, or it tells me that go into command mode, that's the blue box, right? Hit escape, and then type B or A to add above or below. So you can see like if I click here and I go into command mode and I hit A, it adds above, B, it adds below. So we can really use that again to manipulate how these cells work and how they're structured. All right, I do want to note that on ed, notebooks work exactly the same way. We're gonna have the same kind of structure, right? We have cells, and then I can then execute and run cells. So I can again execute that, this is a cell, and I can again hit Shift Enter in order to execute the cell. So that's all gonna work exactly the same way that it does in sort of this other demo of Jupyter Notebook. However, you'll notice that some of the menuing interface is and the coloring is a little bit different in ed because they're using a slightly different presentation of Jupyter. So in particular, things I want to note is that, again, you just run and write cells. It runs the same way. Again, it tells you what the output of that cell is. There's even a little button if you want to run that cell in case you forget to Shift Enter. It tells you when a particular output was created. You can, if you need to reset the kernel, you can do that by using this little reset button up here at the top. So it looks like a little like refresh button. It's up sort of off in that corner there. If you do that restart kernel thing, that does the effectively restarting work. It doesn't clear all the outputs, but it will sort of restart everything to sort of make that run. And then you can click run all to go ahead and run all the cells sort of one at a time, top to bottom. And so that should be able to get you then working through Jupyter on ed. Otherwise, it's the same kind of system. That'll get you where you need to go. Great. And so that's basically where we'll be writing Python code. What we'll be doing is we'll be writing code inside of these cells, executing that code in order to see what happens, writing more code in more cells, executing that, see what happens, and that's basically how we will give instructions to the computer through Python.